Welcome back. This time I am with John Engle, senior partner at the New Hegemony Institute, and we are going to discuss some topics on the irregular behavior of the markets and also about some geopolitical issues that are relevant at this very moment. Um, because this is a new think tank, I would like to, John, please to introduce the New Hegemony Institute and to explain us why it's necessary at this point and whether it would be closer to the RAND Corporation or to the FDR's rules-based system.
Great, and thanks for having me. As you said, I'm from the New Hegemony Institute. We're a new think tank. Our focus is on geopolitics and geostrategy, and in positioning alternative pathways for the usage, expansion, and implementation of sort of U.S. power towards establishing and continuing the rules-based world order that it has underpinned since World War II, and it has been the sort of sole guarantor of since the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. Our focus is on thinking about new ways of thinking around what American power means and for itself and for the world, and how to make a world that is safe for America, but also that underpins and supports a rules-based order that the rest of the world can get behind. It's especially important now at a time when the last 30 years of America's position as sort of sole hyperpower and more or less hegemon of the sort of world order has come under threat both from regional and would be sort of broader rivals, and the sort of initial responses falling into sort of more traditional American strategies of blunt force or isolationism or inability to fully integrate or utilize any of the international institutions that it underpins. So what we talk about, what we focus on is ways the US can recalibrate itself for not only more efficient and better power projection and maintenance of the world order, but also thinking about tackling new frontiers of geopolitical uh, contest, I guess you would call it,
Mhm.
and competition in places everywhere from the Arctic to space.
Yeah, but it's curious how intertwined are the some problems that comes from the end of the Soviet era to what we have now. I have, for as much as I have tried to find a reasonable explanation of how the Russian people became submitted meekly to Putin in 1990, after 1990, after 1999, considering that that same Russian people rose in protests when the communists tried to launch a coup against Gorbachev. So a people that has been that had meekly accepted the Soviet yoke uh, suddenly recovers some sense of democracy and then submits again after the ruble crisis because the liberation of the Russian economy, not much different from what happened in Eastern Germany, was made in such irresponsible ways that at the end the Russian people ended up paying the bill of believing in the West, right?
Yeah, and I can, if you allow me to sort of tell the
Mhm.
story, I think it leads into everything. It's really like the 1990s and our relationship with Russia and how the United States reacted to and responded to the fall of the Soviet Union and its aftermath really, I think, is the basis on which we can understand basically everything else that's happened up to and including the war in Ukraine. So, as you said, when that Russia's uh, democratization, so to speak, or post-Soviet governing and economic architecture when it came into being, they had hoped for, and the Russian people, the Russian government essentially begged the United States at that point for essentially a new Marshall Plan. That they, when they essentially surrendered at the end of the Cold War without a shot fired, they understood that their economy was in collapse. But rather than offer that support, the United States more or less decided to go with the sort of Chicago School of Economics policy of shock therapy and just allowed essentially the deregulation and privatization of the Russian economy to happen piecemeal and quite chaotically. The result of that was enormous economic dislocation, huge economic issues, not like especially for places outside of the like core industrialized and cosmopolitan parts of Russia. And the outcome was also that the people who filled that void, who took over those industries, became the oligarchs.
Mhm.
And so in that world, there was a democratically elected government, but the power at that, much of the power in the country belonged to this small gang of essentially like gangster, call it gangster capitalism, I guess. Like if you want to use the term
No,
for,
it's the
oh,
right term. Yeah,
yeah,
the tragedy of all that is that this new democratic spirit that had been born in the Russian people was killed precisely by the West.
yeah, 100%. And there's two outcomes of that. Like, firstly, when they turned to Putin, uh, in the like a large and a major reason why he's retained control and like a fairly high degree of public support, like in Russia, is because he was the only one who was willing to put the gangster capitalists of the oligarchs back in line and take control of them. He didn't just he
Mhm,
jailed a lot of them, clipped the wings of others, but the it was seen and still is as a significantly better alternative to like what it was, which was the sort of feudalism, like sort of like modern feudalism that was developing. So like there is a component there where people absolutely where I think we in the West misunderstand like why there is that sort of bedrock backing for Putin and his regime and fear of what would come if he wasn't there. But secondly, it also helps explain why, which is also something that like people in the West seem to just not get sometimes, is why the Russians don't like us. It's because we left them to the wolves in the 1990s. Like
mhm,
we decided to be sore winners and they suffered the consequences. And it should be no surprise then that then and in the decades to follow that they do not trust us to have their best interests at heart because we never have. So we often, I think, this is one of the things that we try to focus on is that these sort of core assumptions that we often allow to essentially color our national thinking and the way the press talks about, the way our politicians talk about it in the United States, to just completely miss the real issue and to thus like not ever be able to like pinpoint solutions. Because like we get to the Ukraine war. People talk about Putin being this evil dictator wanting to destroy us. Like he is oppositional to us because we chose to make not to make Russia a friend. Like in an alternative world of the 1990s, there is absolutely a scenario where it's pretty easy to see us investing enough in Russia to help them do what we did in every other dictatorship that we had previously turned into a democracy, which was invest, support their institutions until they can stand up on their feet. Like we've done it successfully across Europe and in parts of East Asia, like Japan. Like the key thing was that we spent the money on it, whereas in the 90s we were just satisfied with winning. So we won the Cold War but lost the peace afterwards. Russia has rebuilt itself over time and is not our friend, uh, internationally, and they see us as a threat, and that fear at the top, especially like Putin's uh, and his core circle, like understand and that given the opportunity, the West, led by the U.S., would happily topple them. And it's hard to work with people who if you who you know want you dead if you show weakness for even a moment. And he knows this, and from experience. Let us look at any of the dictatorships that have more recently been overthrown. Look at Gaddafi. Look at Syria. We have dictators who, as soon as they're great friends of the U.S. who we did business with happily, the second there was an opportunity to get rid of them, we were ready to kill them. Apparent like the maybe apocryphal, but there was widely reported by multiple sources in the mid 2000s that when Gaddafi was uh, essentially murdered by his people on camera, that Putin made his cabinet watch it over and over again and said and sort of helped solidify apparently their belief that there is no real peace with the West because they'll always try that they're always waiting for the opportunity to destroy you. And that's one of the big problems with the way the sort of post-Cold War world order has taken shape. That a lot of countries that could be friends, that could be coaxed towards rule of law, towards democracy, fear doing so because their political elite is always at risk of just being uh, thrown to the wolves by the West. That's a key problem. And I think it's a theme that you see play out in almost every conflict that's happening across the world the last decades. In the case of Ukraine, like you see it as well. Like the Russians, way before Putin, way before the Soviet Union, their grand strategy is always focused on controlling the geography that allows other countries to penetrate its heartland, which is enormous. They either have to keep people out and on their fringes, or they have to allow enemies to come in and destroy them like piecemeal like in their heartland. And their strategy has been to try to prevent that as much as possible. That's why there's so much fixation on the Baltic states, on Ukraine, like in the Russian strategic thinking. It makes perfect sense from that perspective, where they are a country that has been swept over by invaders at different times throughout their history to sort of to think in those sort of terms. Now, in the modern like where we are today, in a like massive drawn out war in Ukraine, that Russia, when they entered it at the start, the special operation is what they call it still. They clearly did not think it was going to take as long as it has. I think their goals were also likely going like their war aims have definitely escalated over time as well, which is frequently the case when wars drag out and become more costly. But
And they had a reason to believe that, because the first thing Biden did when the invasion started was offering Zelensky a plane, and his answer was, I need ammunition, not a right." So that was out of their calculation. But my that brings me to my point. Unfortunately, I don't. You are not going to turn overnight Russia into a democracy, because they have again become the meek people that Stalin moved against. For instance, what you mentioned against about neighbors, to the war against Finland. So the problem is the two political parties, because they try to play bravado about China, they try to play bravado about Russia, and of course, the media has made a terrible job to help people connect the dots. Because people don't read foreign affairs or the articles in the Rand Corporation or Jack Watling or anything else. They just read the highlights.
True.
And in my opinion, if the American foreign policy should have been aimed from the very beginning to engaging with China, because you don't see that kind of militaristic behavior or destabilization efforts like in the case of Georgia. In the case, you see a lot of skirmishes in the South China Sea and Taiwan, but no concrete the steps at invading anything, at least in a long time, since the times of the Tibet.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in the case of Russia, you see constant efforts to destabilize. In, they have been successful in Georgia so far, in Slovakia. They are still trying in Moldova, and so if the reasonable policy should be isolate Putin and engage with China, because without China, the Putin's military machine has no lifeline, would not last long. Why do you believe the Republicans, and especially Democratic politicians, are not helping people connect the dots about what would be a reasonable foreign policy?
Well,
All you see is just a bravado. China, Democrats are weak on China, so we are going to get stronger on China by selling weapons to Taiwan, even though we know that under no game war scenario, Taiwan can stop China. And then we will sell weapons to the Philippines, and that's what you see.
yeah. So like, there's a few points to like
Mhm.
unpack there. So like, in the case, just briefly on the case of Russia and the issue in Ukraine. One of the big issues is that I agree that there is a remarkable lack of nuance or sort of long-term strategic thinking on the part of either of the U.S. political parties or even the defense establishment. But in the context where we can't set the clock back to the 1990s, we can't set it back to the early 2000s. There was no opportunity to go back in time, right? To fix it. So dealing with what we have now, where if Russia decided, due to their, quite rapid and uh, unrecoverable demographic decline that's occurring, their gradual, technological gap that continues to widen, there was uh, this in the absence of being able to make us make them our friend, our being like the U.S. and the West, clipping their wings and making them unable to project power further or threaten it is probably the next best solution. And in that sense, the way the Ukraine war has played out has achieved that to as much a degree as probably could have been hoped for. By that I mean Russia has had to mobilize a huge part of its male population. It's that young male population isn't going to grow back, like their uh, population's in decline. So already accelerating that, they've depleted a huge amount of their most advanced and useful war material, stuff that is difficult to replace, some of it which is impossible to replace. And added to that, the cost of occupying either part or all of Ukraine long term will be very costly. So really, from a U.S. war aim standpoint, a scenario in which Russia wins the war and like they get most of what they want and some agreement that allows America and the West to save a degree of face is sort of the optimal outcome for the West because it occupies Russia is now more diminished and will continue to diminish like military capacity in that one region, preventing them from really getting any ideas about pursuing that like additional expansionist activities elsewhere. So I think like a couple things really.
Probably I have a disagreement there because if you let Russia win, next step, Putin will win in the terms that are the most humiliating for Ukraine as possible in order to destabilize Ukraine. Because that way Ukraine will feel betrayed by the West after the Biden's appeasement and Trump's bias towards Putin. So I believe it's much more a much more reasonable way would be helping Ukraine to hold the line in the short term. What will bring us to the issue of procurement. But consider this: Ukraine has 1 million, 1 million army strong, about 1 million army strong, has been proven to be a successful laboratory for drone warfare. issues that would be very helpful to motivate the overhaul of the European defense industry, who are reluctant to send troops, who so far don't have clear guidelines about how they are going to use those funds. So, I mean, the 800 billion euros committed to the overhaul of the defense industry. So if you let Ukraine fall, it will be it would only that would only elevate Putin to the rank of senior partner in the Yuan zone, because let's be honest, there are some, let me call them fools, some fools who believe that you can gain Putin back to the West. Putin is not going to go back to the West, because he knows yeah, and yet they are, by doing that, they are pushing China towards Putin, and as this has been happening, China is helping more and more the Putin's military machine. At first, it was a veiled effort. Now it's more in the open. So, if so, the only reasonable strategy would be to hold the line. Actually, even Jack Watling says that the problem is the transition. In the case of Europe, in the case of Europe's procurement, that in the long term, the rate of casualties, the clay feet of the Russian economy will start taking its toll and force Putin to accept a peace that is more to save face, but not to spoil the Georgian model as he is still trying to do.
All right, great. So the thing about the war in Ukraine is that, you know, in a even in a sort of ideal world in which Ukraine had the manpower and resources to ultimately like win their war with Russia, that outcome has downsides for Europe and the United States in general, because should Ukraine win, we would be on the hook more or less for, you know, the $1 trillion plus rebuilding of the country that will be required. If Putin has control of it, it's his problem. I'm saying this, you know, not this isn't a uh, shall we say a principled moral stance, but in dealing with great power conflict, you sometimes need to think in terms of the realpolitik of the moment. And in the case of this,
I understand that, but the matter is that what happens if Trump wins, Putin wins, uh, impact the Royal United Service Institute has mentioned in a past article that is in its webpage. The problem is that Putin is going to use that newfound power in its foreign policy and way in our relations with China, because then, as a senior partner, you can see it, or you can start seeing it already in the case of North Korea. It was unthinkable before to believe that North Korea could bypass China. Now it's what they are doing. They are sending troops, they are sending workers to build shaheds for Russia, and that's my concern when it comes to resources. Just see the way Russia is expanding from the Sahel to other parts of Africa. So in the end, it could be much more expensive to let Putin win. That's why my idea was that America's foreign policy should aim to isolate Putin, to downsize him to the rank of Kim Jong-un, and deal with China, to try to bring the relations with China in more or less the terms that we had with Japan in the 1980s and 90s.
Okay, I'll address these sort of in turn, and then I'll address China last because then we can pivot into like what China's like sort of strategic uh posture is and what their priorities are, right? So just turning back to this like subject of Russia become like it and Russian power in either scenario, right? Like let's take the scenario where I don't see any scenario in which Ukraine wins and regains its previous borders, or Russia accepting, or Russia completely taking over and essentially annexing the entirety of Ukraine. I don't think either of those scenarios are either are likely. The much likelier outcome is somewhere in the middle. The question is where. It seems that Russia's red lines now, given how costly the war has become for them, is that they reduce Ukraine's ability to uh, make independent international relations decisions on their own, but probably more importantly from a territorial perspective, taking over the areas, basically denying Ukraine access to the Black Sea. The power gains to Russia from that in grand terms is probably limited. Like if what little they gain in terms of natural resources, they have to manage or through puppets manage would have to have control of like a decent part of the world's grain supply. But that's already the case, and Russia already sells gas to the people who are fighting them now anyway. Like that's not a huge challenge, like in that sense. But like the bigger issue, right? Like there is that what happens if Ukraine holds the line and Russia is forced to essentially concede defeat? That all these years of effort have basically
I don't
been
believe
nothing.
they are concede defeat. You have to you would have to give them a way to save face. For instance, they have used a lot this narrative of existential threat. If you could make China a guarantor in a peace deal where they say that the West is not going to try to invade China, otherwise, excuse me, Russia, otherwise China is going to join Russia. That's not going to happen, but it's a way to save face. And honestly, I don't know how the Ukrainian war is going to end in terms of territory. But in my opinion, if you want real peace, you need two conditions. One, that Europe be able to meet to successfully be successful in the transition in its defense system, which is right now a chaos because that would be a deterrent for Russia. And second, that you could get you can use the economic crisis in China, the Trump's tariffs, as a way to get China involved in a new world order where China would cut the lifeline of Russia if Russia starts with a new militaristic endeavor after the war of Ukraine ends, which wherever it ends in terms of territory. So because if without a lifeline, uh, but you have to give them an excuse, of course. Putin cannot afford, Putin, like the same way as Khamenei, cannot accept defeat because otherwise all his regime crumbles. But I believe these two conditions are imperative to bring China back to the table, to connect it to the West, so Putin cannot become the privateer in the yuan zone, and second, that Europe has to be serious in the transition to overhaul its defense industry, which implies consolidating it to because right now it's a joke, and you don't have guidelines, you don't have long-term contracts. Even Jack Watling a little bit mocked the British defense system in his one of his latest articles.
Right. But like I think like so the problem so here's the issue, right? Like like Russia so whatever get security guarantee like whatever agreement happens, like the US and Russia, neither of them are going to agree to have China be a party to that like to guaranteeing like whatever that piece is. Like Russia's interest is in eliminating foreign influence on its sphere of influence, not bringing in a new one, especially not one that on which they're like quite dependent on other things. I think that's kind of a non-starter. I think the European development of their own defense capabilities has to happen regardless. Although basically anywhere outside of Ukraine, any of the other target states in the Baltics or further west are NATO members, and the United States will draw the line at that. And Putin knows that even if the U.S. didn't put full boots on the ground, that the level of support that would be given to the to European states, any European state or group of chat like that got hit by a Russian invasion would dwarf what's been supplied to Ukraine. There is no like Ukraine's proven to be an incredibly difficult pill to swallow for Russia, and it's forced them to rethink what their ability to impact the rest of Eastern and Western Europe are. And I think it's been pretty good in that sense that Russia thought that they could roll over Ukraine and start threatening the Baltics. Now it looks like the best they can hope for is to get a chunk of Ukraine that can make and keep Ukraine permanently out of NATO to as basically the best outcome they're going to get. And at the cost of like a ton of their military capacity is a pretty good win for us. And if you don't want them projecting power or being a privateer, one of the best ways to do that is keep most of their uh, manpower in basically locked into occupying Ukraine.
Yeah, let me put you two examples.
Hmm.
That back before the war, basically it was Ukraine who supplied China of grain.
Hmm.
During the war, even during the war, China preferred the central Turkmenistan to Siberia too, in terms of energy. So China is much more comfortable not depending on Russia. And in a way, in declarative terms, they are already linked militarily under the Shanghai Organization Corporation.
Hmm.
So peace term like what I prepare, I proposed was would be not something that was going to happen necessarily, but something that in declarative terms would help Putin save face. On the other hand, you see the case of Afghanistan, which is, in my opinion, very telling about how Putin envisions his relation with China. China at first recoiled from the idea of exploiting Afghan lithium, but now they are coming back to the idea. Why? Because Putin is proposing the Taliban at terms similar to the ones he proposed in the Sahel. So they could build a pipeline to get their oil and energy closer to India. So that's, in other words, Putin tried to play a privateer for China. If you and China is not interested in having that privateer, but they will have to accommodate if Putin is elevated with a victory over Ukraine.
Uh, yeah, I understand like those are all considerations. I think they are things that are going to be essentially they essentially have limited impact on like the ability of Russia to like long-term project power. Like obviously there's like issues with um basically pa power projection in Africa. These are all like concerns. But as long as Russia's essentially core interests are like under threat in varying ways, like from uh from Western Europe from having to occupy Ukraine, all those efforts are limited. I mean, like China's not going to suddenly become a vassal of Russia because Russia happens to like sit on Ukrainian grain. Like the relationship is still overwhelmingly in China's favor there.
Yeah, of course.
So
That's why I say senior partner, because before Ukraine, Russia was just a minor partner, a bit more than Kim Jong-un, of course, but a minor partner. With in the case of there have the Chinese economy has been unable to solve its overcapacity problem. That has led them to this deflation. And right now they are trying to divert markets from the United States, but still, even somebody like Paul Krugman considered that if cornered against the wall, China would have to would be tempted to what he called foreign adventurism, which implies war, and that is not it's a bit remote, but it's a possible scenario. What do you believe? What do you think?
yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of scenario that I don't think has like a ton of feasibility or like concern. I think like Russia's capacity to do anything is pretty limited. Their ability to meaningfully affect anything outside of their narrow sphere of influence is limited. China has its own issues, and their problems are in the opposite. Most of their priorities are in the opposite direction. They found Russia a very useful counterweight to us, which is why limiting Russia's capacity, like basically limiting Russia's ability to make further mischief, uh, but through like the efforts in Ukraine to date and any outcome thereafter, like should uh kind of yield the results that we want. But dealing with Russia, as an adversary, we've cornered them, and they're forced. They've tried very hard to take on one country on our sort of the American imperial periphery, so to speak, the Western periphery, and they haven't really succeeded. That has like pretty significant implications for other countries. I mean, if you look at China, their military equipment, most of their like heavy equipment and doctrine as well, are in many ways modeled on that of the Russians. Uh,
It's they have the third army, but yes, basically they are not comparable to Russia's army. Yet what they still have are very wide financial backs. Uh, they have lots of resources that could help. If let's put in a scenario, China decides to support Putin's war machine more openly. So in that case, Putin could keep rolling, could keep waging war for years, maybe 5 more years. While right now they are struggling because the Russian economy has started showing fatigue and has started declining.
sorry, could you say that again? Like, could you reset say that again?
Yes, that uh, I agree. So China has the third economy in the world, but
Hmm.
it's not comparable to Russia's army, even right now, even despite the casualties, even despite now, because in terms of in the sustainability of the war in Russia is very limited because the economy is started showing signs of fatigue. It's starting to decline.
Right.
While China has enough economic power that if it could openly back the Putin's war machine, the war in Ukraine could easily extend 5 more years. So, considering that, is don't you think it would be the easy one of the two because Russia, Europe has to take more seriously the issue of defense, but one of the two requirements to get real peace would be to bring China back to the table with a trade deal.
I mean, I think a trade deal is important, but I don't think that the war in Ukraine is going to be a deciding factor. Like, there might be something to be said for doing a deal to end the war in you like basically to withdraw support from Russia, like in exchange for a better trade deal. The problem there is that you probably really increase the probability that Russia's war effort falls apart before you get to a peace deal.
That yeah, but that just that consideration precisely would put pressure on Putin in order to get at least a ceasefire, while
But
Europe continues.
it's an incredibly risky thing to do, and also it doesn't seem to necessarily be in China's strategic interest to endanger their relationship with a useful tool in the form of in the form of Russia in exchange for uh, a promises about a trade deal. Maybe under a different type administration and different kind of like U.S. leadership, China could
I
become
know
some
I'm
kind
not
of
considering that an option under that it could be applied with Trump, but let's say Democrats come back to power and you get not another Biden but another FDR who wants to do the things right. Of course, China is not going to betray Russia. Is not going to, but China could play ball because it's in their best interest to find a way out of the deflation. Despite the many packages they have spent to revive Russia's economy, excuse me, the Chinese economy, the Chinese economy is still stuttering. This would a trade deal would help China to get out of this predicament, while at the same time it could be a guarantor of that Russia is not going to be threatened existentially by the West.
um yeah, I mean, it's ultimately these are sort of like theoreticals, like
Yeah,
I
it's
think
theoretical.
we have to think mostly in terms of like the possible. And I think
In the short term, I'm not optimistic about the possible because in the short term you have Trump. I am because what happens if you are Frederick Merz, or if you are Xi Jinping, you are trying to make calculations for 2029 when Trump goes. But if you get another Biden, you will know that you are on your own. On the other hand, if you have an FDR who proposes a new rule system, then you may want to entertain the idea of holding the line until Trump goes away. And the Democratic Party is not doing even that.
yeah, and I think I think they can't count on on a significant like ideological shift on a lot of those things. So they have to operate them with what they know. And given that the Ukraine war probably can't drag on all that much longer, uh, the outcome kind of they have to assume that like whatever outcome is going to be reached has to be reached like under the current like political leadership conditions.
Mm-mm. Theoretically, it could. Watling has proposed scenarios under which it could, but it will depend on Europe. Basically, 100% on Europe. And on that case, what the steps to integrate Ukraine to the overhaul of the European defense system is not clear. So far, it's not clear. And before I move to Iran. I would like to ask you something because probably you could help me understand something that has been happening in the market. That is this odd behavior, at least in the last 5 years, of the yield of the 10-year Treasury and the dollar.
Mhm.
After you see that this discrepancy, how they part ways in a way that would be odd considering the existence of tariffs that should have the opposite effect. You could say, well, that's effect of the uncertainty because actually that odd behavior starts in April 2, Liberation Day. But last Thursday, you had that the auction of treasuries, which
Mhm.
under that scenario should have been a failure, was on the contrary, it was a success because it reflected at least, if not trust, that at least that it was more reliable than other alternatives. Um, so how do you explain that odd behavior? Are the markets actually considering considering that Trump's tariffs and budget issues could bring the economy, could get the American economy to a new normal, or they are still expecting a recession, a cataclysmic recession, which was what happened just before, what happened with the market before Trump recoiled in his past attempt to increase tariffs too.
I mean, the Treasuries subject, like as like the sale, I mean, they basically they don't really fail. Like it's Treasuries, U.S. Treasuries remain considered to be like the best like place to park excess capital, like not only by U.S. institutions but internationally. Obviously there's been disruption, but it doesn't change the fact that the dollar is the world reserve currency, that our financial markets are still the sort of uh hub around which all others sort of revolve. And there's,
Yeah,
it
but
benefits from the fact that there isn't
but
much of an
tariff
alternative.
tariffs and all, the dollar instead of appreciating is depreciating, while the treasuries, for the reason of that, at least they don't find any better alternative, have remained relatively, the yields have remained relatively high.
Uh,
There's some oddity there, right?
oh yeah, I mean, well, like part of that is the sort of embedded inflation of very loose monetary policy of throughout like especially during like the COVID pandemic. Enormous amounts of liquidity was injected into the marketplace, and that when it trickles out to end consumption and production, you end up with uh, like a sort of inflationary pressure. That's obviously going to happen, and that's been playing out with the dollar. And that's essentially you know tariffs are a can be a compounding factor in various ways, but in the particulars, it's sort of happened irrespective, if not independent of uh, chaotic tariff policy.
How likely do you believe it could be a recession, especially in Europe, because China is already in a recession as a consequence of these tariffs?
I mean, it's certainly uh, possible. Like it seems to be like if there's a lot of economic dislocations like across the world, like in the US as well, like both economic and financial markets that have been not been unwound, that have sort of been building for decades, really, and haven't been unwound significantly.
But in the last years, even during the Biden years, you see that there is a gap because of the inflation. But there is still a correlation between those two patterns, the treasuries and the dollar index. But now, did you find this odd behavior, the dollar falling and the treasury yield keep still rising on its own way? So that is that odd behavior. So let me put this question in a more simple terms. That is the uncertainty of the market. The uncertainty in the market, in your opinion, is explained by basically by Trump's policies or by something else?
I think it's tariffs are probably a triggering incident for it, certainly. Like
Mhm.
obviously they've usually moved in lockstep, like since Liberation Day, very significant divergence, and that comes from expectations of far higher tariff barriers. Uh, it's a uh, certainly a worrying divergence in that sense. It's not, but not inexplicable.
Anyway, because you see that old behavior starting in April too, not before. Even when Trump was president, even when Trump started increasing tariffs on Canada and Mexico and other, made some other skirmishes. But this odd behavior started in April too.
Well, I
It's
think it's yeah, and it makes sense because while each of those were in like sort of individual trade relationships, the market could digest it.
Well, then let me go to Iran. What are the scenarios you envision in the case of the Iran conflict? The most likely scenarios.
Um, Basically, the most likely scenario
Mhm,
is uh, that we just had in the last couple hours Iran do their retaliatory strike on a U.S.
mhm,
base. Seems to be largely symbolic. They had to respond
mhm.
in some way. So the most likely outcome and probably the optimal outcome is that the sort of U.S. Iran conflict, at least, is considered resolved for the moment, right? That you have um, uh, basically a scenario, like basically it's a scenario in which the U.S. doesn't have to commit overmuch to the region, and Iran doesn't have to fear regime change. Although there are worrying levels, shall we say, of like conversation about pursuing something like that. It seems though, apparently, like it's been reported now that the US warned Iran in advance about like their plan to hit the three nuclear sites, which is in keeping with past strategic behavior as well. And it's likely that Iran probably warned the US in that case, like about which, base they were going to shoot rockets at. Um, the US in general doesn't want to go to an all-out war with Iran.
That would not be the reasonable outcome, but you see that Trump even dismissed his own Central Intelligence.
Right. Yeah, they go. There's huge problems going on. The
Mhm.
fact it's the like and that's a big problem that like can't be ignored is the fact that uh the U.S. intelligence community had like was pretty clear, and most of the world was pretty clear on like agreed upon facts about like the state of Iran's like nuclear weapons program, which was that it was essentially on hold and had been for years, and that this the Supreme Leader and the Central Command and all his allies were not actively pursuing that path. It's very difficult in a diplomacy setting to uh to capitulate to terms that don't exist, right? You can't meet terms uh that, in this case, um end a nuclear program that you aren't doing, right? So it put kind of the entire world in a bit of a bind, like with what's been happening there, right? So the U.S. struck these nuclear sites, which is like where nuclear enrichment is happening.
Mhm. Yes, but
Uh, but like like it but if we get down to like the real issue, right? Like what's causing this? The U.S. didn't want this. The U.S. didn't want to do this right now. Like if we were going to take action against Iran, we'd do it on our timetable. That's conventionally what, a dominant power that has the ability to project power prefers to do. The issue is our ally, so much as they behave as allies,
ye-
is has been Israel. Like
yes,
they,
Netanyahu dragged the United States to the war because Trump was trying to negotiate, and after the fact of the attack, Trump, instead of sending a warning to Netanyahu to not interfere, he jumped on Netanyahu's wagon and started dismissing his own intelligence and starting demanding regime change, the same as Netanyahu. That's a problem. Um, so I also believe that the Khamenei is going to try to bring this conflict to some kind of safe point, like what happened after they killed Soleimani.
yeah, and
But
that
still the issue remains that because Trump doesn't seem to have a clear personality and is easily pushed by Netanyahu and others, what happens if Iran, especially the Revolutionary Guard, keeps attacking bases, keep attacking, say, so what is the likelihood of boots on the ground?
I think the likelihood of boots on the ground is extremely low, and I do not think that Iran as a regime, as like a country, are will be willing, even like extreme elements within the Revolutionary Guard Corps, like are not eager to have their government overthrown. Like if they forced us to do it, like as in if Iran decided to shift from what is currently a defensive, like a wholly defensive posture towards the US and only retaliating to our acts of aggression, if they were to change course and launch some kind of full-scale conflict, that might change things.
So I agree that the most likely outcome is going to be that both Trump and Khamenei are going to try to save force, to try to save face. But on the stream, even though it's less likely, the possibility of the Revolutionary Guards, who are most of whom are fanatics, they could force, for instance, the Basij, um, keep pushing for to answer any attack from the United States on bases or American interest. So the likelihood is not is low, but it's not remote that the Americans could go to take to to put boots on the ground, especially, for instance, we learned that Fordo, there are parts of Fordo, for instance, that were not really destroyed, that
Mhm.
the damage was only in the surface. So, and in that case, of course, the Revolutionary Guards would go the way of the Taliban, who has been proven successful. You just, right?
Yes, like I mean, there's a few things like to consider in that event. Like I would say that it is probably less likely that internal forces within Iran try to force the issue than internal forces in the US try to force the issue.
No,
Uh,
not for the issue in the case of Iran, because they know, so they like their palaces as
yeah.
much as of Mullah Omar overloved his
Oh, so you mean if
palaces.
there's a breakaway group within, like if should a sort of uh unspon like a sort of unsponsored version of Hezbollah be launched like by disaffected members of the Revolutionary Guard, sort of starting as entrepreneur terrorists, basically.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, it's not impossible. Uh, there already are people who join like who join international terrorist organizations for the most part, with the exception of Hezbollah. Like most are Sunni aligned, so there's been less inclination for Shia, especially Persian Shia, like individuals to of whatever status to like join a lot of those movements. Is there a market for it? Maybe. However, uh, I do not I do not see a sort of rogue elements being enough to drag like the US into like a boots on the ground sort of conflict. Like in the event that, let's say,
But they have the resources because these the Quds plus Basikwa plus militias are about 600,000 people, and they have the know-how. Remember the case of al-Sadari in the case of Iraq. So Shia's militias fighting the Americans in Iraq. So they have the know-how, they have the resources, and they have geography in their advantage.
right, but like they wouldn't be fighting like it's like they have well they we don't have any bases in Iran, so if they were planning to attack if these
Iraq.
Iraq like so if, like see so you yeah, I mean like it's not impossible that that there will be like a higher incidence of that. That's always been a risk though. I I would suggest that within the sort of military hierarchy, any like leadership or highly skilled individuals in the Revolutionary Guard and broader Iranian military leadership are probably less inclined towards pursuing those exact courses of action at this particular moment, given how much they are in the crosshairs of the US. Rogue individuals obviously happen. And if that were like, let's imagine like a new or like much revived and stronger sort of rogue element were to arise without state sponsorship, like the Iranian government would have to not only disclaim them but probably support, their eradication, especially if they were operating like on the Iranian side of the border and like moving in. Like it certainly would make the life of the Iranian government a lot
I don't
less
believe
pleasant.
what I believe is that of course the first option of the Revolutionary Guards and all these people, the Basij, is not going to be to attack the United States. But this is an autocracy that is based on fear. So they need to they cannot afford the luxury of looking weak. And if Trump, as you see, dismisses his own intelligence to attack Iran just because Bibi told him that the bomb was weeks away, something that he has been saying since 1996, then those radical elements inside the Iranian government could be emboldened. That's my fear. But
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think
I agree with that. That is still a remote possibility.
like if we're talking about state versus state action as opposed to sort of like
Mhm.
sub-state action, like the next escalation within the power of Iran to enact would be what they threatened and what their parliament voted for and what their
Mhm.
leadership wisely chose not to do, at least yet, would be to like blockade and mine the Strait of Hormuz. Like that's their one like big state level action move that they can play that would act like that would work, right? Like would work in the sense that it would cause the level of damage and destruction and disruption that they would seek to do. The big issues with doing that, and the reason why another reason why it's unlikely, not just because the US is a problem for them, but because China would also suddenly become a problem for them. So they also rely on like oil through there. And while, you know,
90% of Iranian oil goes to China.
exactly. So like the point is that, but it disrupts all oil capital markets and messes with everyone else, but it
Yeah, yeah.
directly impacts China. So doing that is a sort of nuclear strategy for them. It has it has uh, some degree of utility in that regard, in that, and they, but that's the sort of thing that would potentially bring in more retaliation. Would it be enough to drive to the point of like regime change level? Still probably not. And if we're smart, it wouldn't. Like, because just to look at it just in those broad terms, like if we were to do anything other than a limited action on the ground, right,
Mhm.
which would have to be staged out of Iraq probably anyway, or Kuwait. Like you're talking about enormous amount of like time and resources to do that. Like the Iraq invasion didn't happen overnight, and Iraq is a country with half the number of people in it than Iran has. It had a much smaller military in terms of people in military service. Iraq also, we had when we invaded there, we had the benefit of an even more overwhelming technological advantage, but also probably most importantly, about 60% of the population was anti-regime and we're pretty ready to uh capitulate or even support us like in that invasion. None of those things exist in Iran. Like,
Actually, in the case of Iran, the conventional part of the war lasted 3 weeks. And it was not until the administration of the Inet Paul Bremer that the Sunnis got the strength and the resources to start waging the war. And this inept person also dismissed Ali al-Sistani, who was a pro-democracy leader in the Shia community. And so it made possible the rise of al-Sadr, who was a more belligerent Shia actor. And but I would like to go back to the spirit of what with which we started this conversation. It's what would have been more sensible, what would have been a more sensible approach to this crisis. Wouldn't it have been better, not for Trump, because I don't expect that from Trump, but for, let's say, a reasonable, more enlightened leader who comes to power in 2029, to undermine the Ayatollah, but not by bombing. That it seems to be the only conceivable position among Republicans and many Democrats, but by strengthening the moderates, because you see, the Obama signed the Iran deal with Rouhani, who was a moderate by Iranian standards,
mhm.
and Trump undermined him with sanctions. The
Yeah, and almost all
result,
the
result,
yeah,
the
yeah.
result, Raisi was elected, who was like Ahmadinejad, but less bombastic. Then Raisi dies in an accident, and Pezeshkian is elected. He even makes an overture to the West to negotiate to get a new nuclear deal, but Biden was too busy turning Netanyahu into Julius Caesar and dismiss Pezeshkian. And then we have this now. So giving victories like a nuclear deal to moderates, and the only the most visible face of the moderates of Iran right now is Pezeshkian. Giving Pezeshkian a victory wouldn't have much better effects to weaken the theocracy, because then either the theocracy would have to step back, because now Pezeshkian is successful, is victorious with a nuclear deal Khamenei couldn't get, or they crack down and then you get a new green movement.
So I would agree that that if we could make a deal with the moderate with a comparatively moderate aligned
Mm.
presidential government, like that's that we like could make a deal with that. matters, I think, less to Iranian policy, although it definitely has impacts, as you say. It matters probably more to sort of domestic storytelling here. So I think the big, in terms of broader policy, because ultimately Iranian policy boils down to the supreme leader's choices. Like they are ultimately in charge, but empowering moderates obviously has benefits to us in a way that it may not be seen to them, perhaps. But uh, I mean, I agree that like some kind of deal of that sort, like a reestablishment or modified version of what was already existing, is the optimal outcome on that. Like there is no because there is no real credible path to enforcing regime change by any other method. As I was saying, as I said, like
That would imply boots on the ground. If you want
right.
to,
But as I said before, with like it's like we took on Iraq in the early 2000s. Our technological advantages were much more were greater than by comparison. It was like that was a country that was half the size of Iran. So we're talking about swallowing that. And in Iran, we don't have a giant like actual majority of the population who would come to our side immediately. It's a much harder task. And if you think about it though, like we also like in that Iraq war, America was really primed for war. Like we really we were ready for it, and we didn't have the memory of what happened in Iraq yet because we hadn't done it yet. Like even then, there was a lot of that work that had to be done to get people on board with an invasion. And this invasion, like an invasion of Iran, would be much more complicated. The resistance would be much fiercer. It's a much larger country. Like we're not no like no one in America besides basically that small group of warhawks who have been desperate for a fight for ages really wanted. If the administration were to try to go through with it, even with congressional approval, the political backlash would be enormous.
yeah, no, I agree on that end, but it's still scary to see some parallels. In 2003, we supported Ahmad Chalabi. Now we are supporting the Chak's son who offered himself for a provisional government. In 2003, Dick Cheney detained the CIA to push their appreciations to footnotes that nobody in Congress read.
Yeah, of course.
Right now, Trump dismisses Tulsi Gabbard in favor of a liar who since 1996 has been crying wolf about the bomb.
I mean, if you want to look at it that way, here's the if you want to sort of think about it to think about like, what the actual consequences would be of like if the US invaded, like beyond the human cost in Iran, the enormous human cost like to American soldiers, which I think the American people would very rapidly realize that they were did not want this at all. Uh, the other consequence is that you're already seeing a fragmentation of the MAGA movement over this. An actual invasion would probably break that up. You're talking about pretty significant domestic political shifts. And when Democratic leadership has been thus far unwilling to openly draw a line about it, you also could see like major changes in leadership on there because while they've managed to learn nothing, it seems, from
In rational terms, I don't disagree. But when you see Steve Bannon coming with his tail between his legs, saying that, well, we will do whatever our leader says after having back Tucker Carlson, you see that it's not impossible. It's less likely because the public opinion right now is definitely against a war, but it's not impossible to at least to tame the MAGA base.
some of it. I think not all of it though. I mean, so many of like the MAGA base have already like broken openly with it and said and talked about America first, and that will get worse. Like that's not going to get better. If it got better in like the run up to an invasion, it would be ex fleeting and temporary at best, right? Like you're talking, like we were
My
talking.
my fear is what happens if Trump gets his Gulf of Tonkin, how that would turn public opinion again in favor of a war.
I think the problem is that people know what the Gulf of Tonkin is, right? Like they know what that incident was. Like we've like the far right especially is extremely primed to ideas about like the idea of false flags and see them everywhere, even when they don't exist. I think you would have to have done that first and then escalate. You can't have an escalation, have the people pushing back, and then suddenly that happens. Like even if it's real, a lot of people will believe it's fake.
That's my fear, especially when somebody like Steve Bannon at first said that he wanted the army going after the invaders, the immigrants, so the nannies and landscapers. Those are the invaders, not in Iran. And then after Trump shook him a little bit, he said with the meekly that, well, the MAGA base will do as Trump says, and that's it.
I'm not convinced that all of them will, but even if they do, the majority of American opinion will be so overwhelmingly against him. Although I wouldn't put it past the Democrats like somehow managing to blow it anyway. Like they are in many respects the worst political party in the Western world in the sense of being least capable of competing against opponents that are frequently arguing on issues that are massively out of favor with the public. And yet, so
I am an FDR liberal, but I agree 100% with what you are saying. So the phrase "weak and woke" it's very telling about what the Democratic Party is right now. But and there are some other issues I would wanted to talk about, but I have abused enough of your patience, so I would like to see if we could retake this conversation in some other times because
certainly.
an issue that in which on which I am very interested is in procurement in the case of Europe,
Mhm.
considering that procurement, those funds may end up wasted like the new generation fund, because of that they are specialists. I don't know if you have to know about the weird uses sometimes those funds have had
Oh
in
yeah.
Spain.
I mean, well, I mean, like it's not a uniquely European problem. I mean, procurement in the United States is one of the things that we are going to be uh, presenting some working on a white paper related to that. Just the astonishing levels of waste when we talk about, military budget and how much bigger it is. The amount of money that ends up actually creating usable war material is so.
Yeah, the Pentagon has failed what 7 audits, right? But in the case of, but at least they get something done. I don't know what they are behind Russia in electronic warfare still, but well, at least they get something done. In the case of
Well, the incentives are
in the
different.
case of Europe, it's basically a joke. I have learned recently that only 25% of the funds allocated during the Olaf Scholz era had been actually ended up in contracts in defense.
Yeah,
That's a
that's
joke.
about right. I think that's about accurate. The interesting th like, yeah, I would gladly have like let's reconvene for another episode or talk
Mhm.
about that. And also, it would be great if we could explore like sort of China and its current
Mhm.
and future like sort of pos in its side of the world.
Yeah, that's an issue on which I am also very interested because there have been very telling articles in Foreign Affairs about their problem with their overcapacity, their demography, and their property sector.
Hmm.
And yet you see that when you have a leadership that looks weird and odd in the case of the United States, even Japan is consider joins proposes make a common front with China and Korea on the issue of tariffs. But I wanted to end this giving you the last word because probably there is something you want to highlight on which you want to bring visibility on something else, or something else you would like to say about the new hegemony think tank.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you so much for this talk and for giving me a platform and for an excellent conversation. I'll just close by saying that a lot of the issues we discussed here today, the war in Ukraine, military rearmament in Europe, American like economic and financial market dislocation, conflict in Iran, influence of Israel, all of these things connect back to the United States, which is still the tail that wags the dog of like of the world in terms of economically, culturally, and importantly, like militarily. And our project, our overarching project, is to offer solutions to some of these issues, looking at them uh, with clear eyes and un uh, biased by what exists now and what has been conventional wisdom, which in large institutional decision making frequently tends to create in unescapable channels that result in driving policy decisions and sometimes nations down terrible roads. And but we believe that the United States is and will be the most important player like on the world stage for a very long time for the foreseeable future. Uh, that a rising China is not going to ultimately threaten that overall unless the United States takes actions that allow that to happen. The the sort of hegemonic stability that the United States has created can only really be disrupted or destroyed by the United States. And there are lots of decisions that have been made, that are being made, and that could yet be made that could create those problems. And the key for thinking about the future is seeing those problems for what they are, seeing the answer, the road answers that are given as not the only alternatives, and recognizing that better policies can be enacted to create change, not just for the benefit of the United States and its citizens, but for all the people who have enjoyed the peace and stability that has existed under the aegis of sort of the Pax Americana within that sort of broader international world order.
And that's precisely, let me take something you just said, is that precisely because the United States, after Trump, unfortunately, during his administration, is still going to be the most important actor. It's important what happens here. And unfortunately, you see extreme mediocrity of both parties. They adopt narratives that are even counterproductive,
Bereft of
and
creativity or vision.
and that's precisely where I hope new hegemony plays a role to bring visibility on new ideas. For instance, if you ask the average man what the New Deal was about, or for FDR's foreign policy, they don't have the slightest idea. They can connect the dots because the parties are not doing. They are just playing to see who is more macho on China or more macho on Russia. No, and that's a non-starter. If so, I wanted to thank you again, and yeah, I have at least the excuse to send you another invitation, probably next week,
Yeah, next week
to,
I'll probably be
to,
around. So
to
yeah.
discuss some on the case of China, as you mentioned, the case of procurement in Europe, that is very important. You see those two pieces that could guarantee actually real peace in the case of at least Eastern Europe. And also, if you want something about counterinsurgency and how this issue is completely absent in the case of the Gaza war.
Uh, yeah, we can talk about Israel and Gaza, like in a whole bunch of different vectors as well, if you'd like. happy to do that.
I have read something about counterinsurgency, and it's astonishing to see how even the Jewish settlers in the West Bank behave pretty much like the Pied-Noirs in Algeria.
Yes. Yeah. With a lot of stuff. But like uh lot of lot lot of threads to pull there.
Yeah,
For sure.
and the matter is that nobody is framing this conflict in terms of counterinsurgency.
That's an interesting question. I'm interested to learn what you mean by that when we talk
Mhm.
next. Like,
Because if let's say you don't care at all about the Palestinians, you want Israel to win. The matter is that if what Netanyahu is doing doesn't make sense
mhm.
in terms of counterinsurgency, then who is this war benefiting? Israel or Netanyahu?
Yeah, that's a good, interesting thing. Like if you can send me what you've been reading and ahead of our next talk, which if you wanted to get it on the books now, I can.
Sure, it's basically I could send you the links to a couple of books, an article by General Yap in the from the times of the Vietnam War, and then well, lots of small articles, but I know about the counterinsurgency, how it has failed, how we have repeated over and over the failed standard of body counting that comes from Vietnam and that went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and
Yeah.
all those cases. That means that the United States doesn't learn. And precisely, I hope your think tank will help people learn and connect the dots so they can corner and make these mediocre politicians accountable.
Yeah. So
Something you
trying
would
to
like to add
learn.
to finish?
Uh, no, we can leave it at that
Mhm.
for now. But like yeah, send me what you got on that, and we can just like add that to the tail end. But I think that also obviously the U.S.'s relationship with Israel and Israel's relationship with
Yeah.
the
Above
Palestinians.
all, to show people how these issues are related to their lives,
Mhm.
because otherwise they seem foreign,
Well,
something that
Israel's doing working very hard to make it part of people's lives now with like making dragging us into Iran.
oh yeah, but that's possible because there is not a real Israel narrative. The Olmert's plan could have brought that narrative. You don't know Ehud Olmert could have provided Biden that narrative, but Biden was too busy turning his pal Bibi into Julius Caesar and never paid attention to alternatives. Um, well,
Yes.
let's leave it there, and I will please let me know your availability next week. If
Would same time as this like basically Monday at 8 o'clock Central Time, 9 o'clock Eastern.
Okay, I will send you the invitation, and
Excellent.
then we will take the rest of those issues. Thank you again. Thank
Okay.
you,
Thank you.
Iggy, and well, that's all.
All right. Great. Have a
Thank
good
you.
one.